Hey guys, it's Jayden Clark here from Jazz Lesson Videos, and today we'll be taking a deep dive into jazz articulation. Jazz articulation is one of the easiest concepts to understand, but the hardest to execute. That is why breaking this down into easy steps and thinking literally about what each part of jazz articulation sounds like is the key to mastering this concept. This then leads us to the question: what does jazz articulation sound like? And we can break this down into do's, dens, and das. These words each correspond with different beats and different offbeats that we articulate. Now, to help us internalize these sounds, we need to understand why each of these sounds are used for different beats. Now, these explanations and exercises can be found in the Articulation Masterclass, and in there you'll be able to find Chad LB's full video masterclass, as well as exercises with approach notes and enclosures, cells, triplets, etudes, and much, much more. To download this masterclass along with supplemental PDF exercises, feel free to click on the link below. So what we can do to dive straight into these articulation sounds is learn about where each sound is placed. The do's are for when we are playing an ascending line and are also articulating on the beat. The dens are for when we are playing an ascending line and fall off the beat in between the do's. Now this is where do-den comes from. Now what you'll notice is that the den acts as a mute for the notes off of the beat, and this makes it different from simply articulating every note on the beat. Now the das are for when we are playing a descending line and fall off of the beat. This descending articulation creates a da-oo sound. Now, when both the do-dens and da-oo sounds are combined on a line that both ascends and descends, they sound like this. Now, it's important to note that the naming of these sounds doesn't really matter, but it's helpful to think of these sounds literally like the names we've just mentioned. With that out of the way, let's jump into some ways in which we can practice this type of articulation. The first type of exercise we'll look at is a major scale diatonic exercise that features different changes in direction. This allows us to practice changing our articulation depending on the direction of the line. Also, because this major exercise is going to be sequential, once we get the hang of the first bar, the rest will come smoothly. So now that we've had a listen to this exercise, let's check out the first measure, as it's the first measure that we'll be taking up and down diatonically in sequence. So the first measure, as we can see, we start on the root, we move down to the 7, and then we go back up a diatonic step, and then we follow up to the 3rd on beat 3, and then of course we move down a step, down another step, and then up another step. That completes our measure. As the pattern moves forward, we simply move that bar up diatonically. Of course, when we are descending, it is slightly different, but we start on the root, go down to the 7 again, root, and then up a step, so it's exactly the same as the ascending version. And then to descend, we move back down to the root, 7, 6, back to the root, and then this voice leads nicely down a step to the next note in the scale. That is the descending sequence. Now, for the ascending sequence, let's take a look at what is happening with the articulation. So as we can see, the first two beats, we have our do-den, do-den. Now, even though the second note descends, because the 4-note cell as a whole ascends, we are treating this as, or at least the equivalent to an ascending line. So we are going do-den, do-den, do. So we land on that do on beat 3. And then, of course, because the next part of this measure descends, we then follow that do with a da, and then on beat 4, we have that oo. So there comes that da-oo, the part of the descending articulation that we mentioned earlier. And of course, the next thing to note is on beat 1 of the next measure, we start that off with an oo. And then that oo restarts the articulation sequence. Of course, on the descending articulation, we have a similar sort of thing. We start off with do-den, do, and then we have that da-oo. So da-oo leading to beat 3. Now, the interesting thing about this particular da is it acts as an inflection point in that measure. So it is the highest point in the measure. And that's an easy way to think of where a da should be placed a lot of the time, especially when the line is changing directions. And of course, the rest of that measure, you can see we have that oo, da, oo, and that oo also lands on beat 1 of the next measure. Okay, so the next exercise, we're going to keep it also simple and diatonic. We're going to check out this using the major arpeggios now. Okay, so looking at the articulation of this, we are starting with a do-den, right? Because the line is ascending. And then notice beat 2 and we have that da. Like I mentioned in the previous exercise, I mentioned that we can have that da on those highest points in the phrase, or those inflection points, okay? Because what we're doing there, when we're changing directions, we're technically, from that da, we are descending down to beat 3. Of course, beat 3, we are landing on that oo articulation. So we have that articulation as follows. We have do, den, do, da, oo, den, do, da, oo, den, do, da, oo, right? So on, so forth through the arpeggio exercise. Okay, so with the descending articulation is a little tricky because we start with a do, and then it's followed by a da, which is typical of our descending articulation. But then we move to another do, followed by a den, right? So the last note of each 4-note cell, right, each arpeggio in other words, is that muted articulation, that den. Now, the reason we have that den on beat 4 is, of course, the line is changing direction. From that den, we are ascending up to the next note in the descending arpeggios to start that next descending arpeggio. Because that part of the line is ascending, well, we're going to use the ascending articulation, the do-den, at that particular point. Let's check out something a little more complicated and with chromaticism now. So here is a chromatic enclosure exercise. Okay, so this pattern here, when we are ascending, features a 1, 2, 3, 5 diatonic melodic cell, followed by moving down a step, and then into what I like to think of as a 3-note enclosure, generally 2 notes above, 1 note below, and then the target note landing on beat 1. Of course, just to clarify, when I say beat 1, of course I mean beat 1 on the next bar. When we are descending, the pattern is very, very similar. It features the exact same enclosure pattern in the second 2 beats. The first 2 beats, however, features a 1, 2, 3, 1 diatonic multi-cell. Okay, now to check out the articulation of this exercise. Now, because we start the line ascending, we start off with a do, then do, and then, like the previous 2 exercises, we have that inflection point, right? The highest point in the phrase. We can change that to a da, seeing as we are changing direction and moving down. Of course, then we can see oo that lands on beat 3, and then we have da-oo, and then we have that lowest point, right? The low point inflection, which is that den, that muted sound, before we move to do on beat 1 of the next measure. So the articulation of the descending now, we start ascending, so we start with our do, den, do, and then what happens in the next bit is that because the den, right, the next den that is on beat 2 an, is ascending 1 note, we are still making that a den, right? We're not making the previous note a da because we haven't truly changed direction just yet. Okay, that true change of direction, that change of articulation comes on beat 3 and we have that da, and of course we finish off the measure with da-oo, den, do, right? So that den, that lowest point on beat 4 and, is leading to the do on beat 1 of the next measure. So a lot of changes of direction here, a lot of subtle changes of direction. A lot of the time when we are doing this sort of thing, if we are moving quickly, it's going to be a little hard to pay attention to exactly which syllable we are using at the given time. But this gives you a guide, right? We can assign general rules to inflection points, right? The highest point or the lowest points in the phrases, or just general changes of direction in the phrases. But there are points in time where some user discretion is advised, of course. Now you can find exercises like those that we have covered so far and more in the Articulation Masterclass and its supplemental PDF. With this resource, you'll be able to go in depth with these exercises and have access to all of Chad LB's thoughts and explanation of jazz articulation. Another thing you'll be able to find are etudes, and we're going to go ahead and check out one of them right now. This etude is over all the things you are, so let's go ahead and take a listen. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into some of the phrasing here and some of the articulation that fits with this kind of phrasing. So, the very first line, of course, we are starting with a few different changes of direction. Okay, so initially we start with an inflection point, but of course from there on, right, we dip down to that C, and then we ascend from there. So we're using that do, den, do for the first 3 notes, followed by the da, which is a clear inflection point, a clear change of direction in the phrase. You can see in beat 3, you have that oo. Of course, it's only got 2 O's there, but we're using oo or oo with an H, right? We're considering them to be the same thing here. We have that oo on beat 3, and then of course we have da-oo, and then we have the den on beat 4 and, representing a change of direction, right? The low point, the low inflection point of the line. So the next measure is kind of interesting because we feature some triplets, right? So beat 1, we start on that do, and of course, similar to the previous measure, we drop down, but we land on a den because the rest of that line is going to ascend from there. Now, with the triplets, you can see a do-en. Now, I like to think of that as simply emphasizing the first note and muting the second 2 notes. So after the triplets, we are highlighting beat 3 with that do, and of course we have the descending line followed by the den on beat 4 and also, like the previous measure, representing an inflection point. Now to continue on with this phrase, okay, so the next measure, measure number 3, we start with a do, den, do, da, so same sort of thing. We have that ascending line, clear inflection point on beat 2 and, followed by an oo on beat 3, and instead of continuing down, the line decides to ascend very briefly again. So from that oo, we go den, do, da. Now the reason we are putting that da on beat 4 and is, of course, that line has already started to descend. So on beat 4, we have that do, but because that is beginning a slight descent, we're putting the da on beat 4 and. So you can see on beat 1 of the next measure, now we're up to measure 4, we've got oo, and then we have a den, okay, because we've finished our descending, that da-oo, the descending, and we immediately start to ascend. So beat 1 and, we're going to put a den, and then on beat 2, we have that do, and then a da, okay? So there's that inflection point once again. This inflection point, at least in this phrase, is highlighted nicely by an eighth note tied to a quarter note. So we have a big emphasis at the top of the phrase. They're almost acting like a big climax of the phrase. Now notice that there's no articulation labeled on the 16th notes. The 16th notes are generally going to be all slurred, okay? So you can see that they're all tied together, all slurred, and then this is followed by a do dot, right? The dot is a new one we're introducing here. Of course, the dot is just representing the end of a phrase. Now it's important to note, even though it's a dot, right? You could easily say dot, dot, really, really quickly. What I like to emphasize is to make it fat, right? So a fat dot, like a dot. Sounds slightly different than a dot. Okay, I always like to emphasize that, especially towards the end of a phrase, we like to play our note lengths for their full value. It just gives a slightly more dramatic effect. Thinking about the sounds of jazz articulation literally makes it easy for us to come up with and designate names to the types of articulation we use depending on what beat we are on. By breaking this down into do's, dens, and das, we can apply these to both ascending, descending, and lines that change direction. To go even deeper into this concept and the exercises we checked out in this video, feel free to download the Articulation Masterclass. Be sure to click the like, the subscribe, and the bell button so you always know when we're releasing new content. As always, feel free to make any suggestions on what we should cover next in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.